Interesting shot here of Ganna's coach. Holy crap, we're going to get beaten by the T-boy. And some reactions to the bromance here at the end. One of intrigue, second of horror, and the third one, isn't that sweet? Today we're going to do a little bit of a recap on the individual pursuit World Champs final, where the amateur, the not even professional cyclist Dan Bigham went up against the god, the monster, his monster, FrankenPig's monster himself, Pipo Ganna, and it's heartbreaking. Spoiler alert, he only lost by 0.05 of seconds in the last kind of 250 meters. Now, if you haven't seen the race, go and check it out on YouTube. It's only 4 minutes long and it's probably one of the best IP finals you'll ever see. And it's extra heartbreaking because apparently about 2 weeks prior to the event in an Andorran training camp on the Ineos camp, Ganna said he wasn't going to ride the IP at the World Champs. So Dan thought he had a pretty good chance of getting to the final and maybe even winning. But when he saw Ganna on the start list only a couple of days prior, his heart must have sank a little bit. But anyway, still did extremely well and nearly won it. And I believe he'll probably come back next year and win it. Let's take a little look in this video about the tech. You basically would think that the tech is exactly the same and the approach is exactly the same because they both essentially work for Ineos. Well, that's completely not true if you look into the nuances of their kind of bike fit, the aerodynamics, and how they use the same equipment in a different way. Now, first of all, before we get onto the bike, which is obviously very interesting, we're going to talk about the main point of aerodynamics, which is the body position. And I believe the two riders approach this kind of CDA problem in very different ways. I think Ganna, because he's such a big dude, you know, he's like 1.9 meters tall, his frontal area, his A part of the CDA equation is never going to be very low. So his main focus is to reduce his CD, his coefficient of drag, whereas I think Dan, it's much easier for him to focus on reducing the A, the frontal area, by just making himself as small as possible. He's a much smaller guy, he's got narrower shoulders. So that's the first kind of element of difference, I think. Now, Ganna's position is very, very similar to his road TT position. There's almost nothing to pick apart between his sort of track position and his road position. And how this changes to Dan is that Dan's, I think, his road position or his kind of even team pursuit position is quite different to how he approaches his IP. And the first thing you can notice is Dan never, ever looks up. His head is buried in his arms. He essentially doesn't look where he's going. It's just head down, pray, and risk everything. Whereas Ganna, you can see in these shots here, he's often looking up, he's often looking where he's going, he's often even sneaking a glance over the track towards Dan, and it's very similar to his road position. Now, staying with the head is probably the most important part of the TT position. To the quick observer, they're using the same casque helmet, but actually they're using it in a very different way. Ganna, you can see, is using a different visor with a very interesting kind of an aerodynamic fence around the kind of edge of the visor. Now, we'll talk about that in a minute, whereas Dan is using the same helmet without that. There's more of a nose cone. He's got much narrower shoulders. Like I said, he's got his head buried in his hands and he's using the helmet basically as a smooth nose cone. Whereas Ganna, he just can't get his frontal area that low. He's too big. It's going to limit his power if he's tucked up like that. So he's using the helmet with that special visor, which I think Dan actually developed and brought into the Ineos team about 1.5 years ago. Has a special visor made with casque. And it's got this very interesting fence around the edge of the visor. Some may call it a gurney flap, some may call it, you know, a vortex generator, but what that's doing is generating spirals off the edge of the visor, which hopefully will flow over the shoulders and over the back of the rider to delay the separation and increase the energy in the boundary layer. Ganna needs that because his head is way more up than Dan's. Dan wouldn't really benefit from that because his visor is basically pointing down and is covered. It's not really exposed to the wind, whereas Ganna's visor is exposed to the wind to energize the boundary layer, help the air stay attached to his shoulders, which the helmet is directly in line with. So same helmet used in two very different ways. My hope is that this TT helmet, which is my TT helmet, does have a similar kind of feature in that this ledge, this lip running around above the visor is sticking out. So you maybe get some kind of vortex generation off the side of this and some swirls up onto the head and then onto the shoulders because of the overlap and the quite sharp crease there. Now, realistically, our mere mortal air speeds and Reynolds numbers just are probably too low to actually get that working, but that's my hope anyway. This has kind of gone out of favour of track riders a little bit, and I think it's basically because it's so narrow. It's not a very wide helmet, so it doesn't really do much kind of shielding of the shoulders, which is the kind of ethos behind the POC helmet. That's just all hope. Who knows? Now, a quick word about the skin suit. Now, it's interesting to see in the bronze medal race, Jonathan Milan, also the same federation as Ganna, the Italian federation, with a completely different skin suit. But they're both wearing, all the riders seem to be wearing the sort of wired underbra for the vortex generation on the arms and the shoulders, so that's interesting to see. Going back to the bronze medal final again, it was really weird to see the same kind of setup between Oliveira and Milan. You've got two very different riders in terms of stature, and it's interesting to see how Oliveira has adopted that same head down nose cone position as Dan did in the final, because they're quite similar. It's like the big guy versus the small guy again. So Milan's got a very similar position to Ganna, maybe not so stretched out, but head up. Oliveira, the smaller rider, can actually comfortably get his head into his hands, never look up. So it's the same kind of ethos as reducing the frontal area as Dan's one. The Pinarello bikes, you've seen these before, they're extremely narrow. They are 3D printed in aluminium, or laser sintered in aluminium with I think a titanium fork and a titanium fork crown. But the ethos behind this is just reducing frontal area. Extremely narrow. It's got an extremely narrow hub spacing, I think 69 on the front and 89 on the rear. And the bottom bracket is the narrowest out of any bike I've ever seen, which is a 54mm custom bottom bracket width. I think the narrowest you can get on road is 68mm. And I think I read somewhere the Q factor on the Kratos cranks that Dan's developed with Wattshot, which both the riders are using, is only 120. So extremely narrow all around, extremely narrow Q factor. That's about 35mm narrower than you'd get on a narrow road bike Q factor. But it's interesting to see that Ganna is actually foregoing some of that narrow Q factor, because he's actually using Favero Asioma Shimano pedals. So he's using a really stock part there. Dan isn't using a power meter, he's just going off splits, but I guess the Federation wanted to see Ganna's power. Now I estimate this to be about 585 watts for 4 minutes, which is absolutely crazy. So if you plug the numbers, do your spreadsheet, I think with a rolling resistance of about 0.002 or just under, and approximate CDA for Ganna, I reckon he's doing about 580 to 600 watts. Absolutely crazy. I expect Dan's probably doing about 80 to 100 less, but with a much lower CDA, you're going to get, a similar result. Tyres, GP 5000 TT, I think they're in a 23 or maybe even 25mm size, and it looks like the bike is actually designed for that. There's plenty of clearance for even a 25mm TT tyre on there, which is quite interesting because, going back even just a couple of years, track tyres were 19mm. Their front end positions of the extensions are completely different. So Dan has gone for a super narrow custom cockpit setup. Obviously he's developed that with Wattshop. He's got his kind of normal shaped Wattshop bars on there, but it's noticeably narrower than he's used over the last 3 or 4 years. I think he's basically got them as narrow as possible, and he's even now got little curved lips on the arm pad, the armrest, so he can actually squeeze his forearms into there, and the little lips help him squeeze them together. They used to have quite a sharp edge on there, but now he's got this sort of little lead in, so he can really squeeze himself together pretty much as narrow as possible. Whereas Ganna's, arm pads are much wider apart. And the interesting thing about Ganna's extension risers is they're not just straight. They're not just the lowest frontal area shape you could have, which would be a straight pillar. They've got this weird sort of serpentine S-shaped curve, and that again is to reduce the total system drag. In isolation, those are probably quite draggy, but with the rider behind them, I think they are vortex generating around the knees and the thighs to lower the system drag off the knees and the thighs, keeping the airflow attached longer around the thighs, which is a massive part of the drag equation, and reducing the pressure drag behind. So interesting to see those two different approaches. Again, Ganna's focusing on CD more, and I think Dan is focusing on more A, reducing the area. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. See you in the next one.